What if I told you that the most humiliating defeat in the history of the Royal Navy was dealt not by a rival empire, not by a seasoned admiral, not by a fortress of steel and stone, but by a tree? On the 28th of June, 1776, 9 British warships carrying nearly 300 cannons sailed toward a half-built fort on a sandy island off the coast of South Carolina. The men inside that fort had 31 guns, barely enough gunpowder for 28 rounds each, and most of them had never fired a cannon at a warship in their lives. Their commanding officer had already been told to abandon the whole thing and retreat to the mainland. By every military calculation that existed in 1776, what happened next should have been a massacre. Instead, by the time darkness fell over Charleston Harbor, the most powerful navy on the planet was limping away in the dark. Its flagship had taken 70 direct hits. Its admiral had been wounded and had literally lost his pants to a flying splinter. One of its newest warships was burning at the waterline, set on fire by its own crew to keep it from falling into American hands. And the man responsible for all of it had built his fort out of trees that nobody in the British military had ever considered a serious building material. I have spent years studying the military history of the American Revolution, and I can tell you with confidence that this battle, fought 6 days before the Declaration of Independence was even signed, is one of the most overlooked and most consequential engagements of the entire war. What happened on Sullivan's Island that June day was not just a military victory. It was proof of something that a lot of people on both sides of the Atlantic were not sure about at the time: that raw colonial troops, outgunned and outnumbered, could stand up to the full weight of the British Empire and win. And the reason they won comes down to physics, geography, one man's refusal to back down, and a very unusual tree. Stay with me, because this story is going to surprise you. Before I take you into the battle itself, I want to make sure you understand the man at the center of it, because without understanding who he was and how he got there, the story loses half its power. And if this is your first time on this channel, welcome. We cover stories exactly like this one every single week, stories that the history textbooks glossed over, stories where the outcome changed everything. Hit that subscribe button so you do not miss what is coming next. Now, if you had asked anyone in Charleston about this man back in the 1750s, they would have told you he was a planter. A well-connected one, yes, but a planter all the same. He was born in Charleston in 1730, the son of a Scottish immigrant who had built a reputation as one of the colony's finest physicians. By the time he was 19, he had married into one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina, a family that owned an 8,800-acre plantation. Under English law, that marriage put him in control of all of it. He added another 1,000 acres of his own. He had money, land, and connections. He had everything a man of his era was supposed to want. But here is what set him apart from every other wealthy planter in South Carolina. He did not stop there. In 1752, he got himself elected to the colonial legislature, launching a political career that would run for decades. And when the Cherokee War erupted in the late 1750s, he did not stay home. He volunteered. He was commissioned as a captain in the South Carolina militia and marched into Cherokee territory. And I want you to understand what that warfare was actually like, because it matters enormously to what happened in 1776. This was not the orderly, line-up-and-shoot style of European battlefields. This was brutal, unpredictable, close-range fighting in dense terrain, where the only way to survive was to improvise, to read your men, and to stay calm when everything around you was falling apart. Those are not skills you learn from a book. You learn them in the woods, with people shooting at you, and most men never learn them at all. By 1774, after years of steady service in both the legislature and the militia, he had risen to the rank of colonel. So when the revolution began heating up in 1775, South Carolina had exactly the kind of man it needed. He was named colonel of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. And almost immediately, he did something that would outlast everything else about his career. He designed a flag for his troops. A simple thing, really. A dark blue field to match his soldiers' coats, with a white crescent in the upper corner. He later wrote in his memoirs that it was the first American flag displayed in South Carolina during the Revolution. He had no way of knowing it then, but that flag would one day become the official state flag of South Carolina. And the reason a palmetto tree was eventually added to the center of that flag, that is exactly what this story is about. Now here is where the story gets interesting, because the British did not stumble into this battle by accident. They came with a plan, and on paper, it looked like a very good one. After being forced out of Boston in March of 1776, the British needed to redirect their entire southern strategy. Royal governors from the southern colonies had been sending letters back to London for months, all saying essentially the same thing. The South is full of loyal subjects, just waiting for the king's army to show up. All Britain had to do was send a force down, rally those loyalists, and the rebellion would collapse from below. General William Howe, the British commander-in-chief, liked the idea enough to send his second-in-command, Major General Henry Clinton, south with a detachment of troops. Clinton was to link up with a separate force sailing from Ireland under Lord Cornwallis, escorted by a naval squadron under Commodore Peter Parker. Together, they would secure the southern colonies and then swing north to help take New York. The plan hit problems immediately. Cornwallis's fleet was battered by storms crossing the North Atlantic and did not arrive until late May. And the great Loyalist uprising the British had been counting on had already been crushed at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in February, where a force of Loyalist Highlanders was decisively defeated by Patriot militia. So Clinton and Parker sat off the North Carolina coast with a massive combined force, and nowhere obvious to use it. That is when they turned their attention to Charleston, and Charleston was absolutely worth taking. By 1776, it was one of the wealthiest port cities in all of North America, a hub for rice, indigo, and trade with Europe and the Caribbean. Control Charleston, and you control the most important harbor south of Philadelphia. British scouts surveyed the harbor and reported back that the American defenses were weak. There was an unfinished fort on Sullivan's Island, a sandy strip of land about 4 miles long at the entrance to Charleston Harbor. Any ship trying to reach the city had to pass right by it. Parker was confident his warships could reduce it to rubble in a matter of hours. What those scouts did not report, because they did not know, was that the channel at Breach Inlet, separating Sullivan's Island from Long Island, was 7 feet deep with a powerful current, not the 18 inches British intelligence claimed. And there was not a single naval officer in Parker's fleet who was familiar with the waters around Charleston Harbor. He had to rely entirely on local pilots who had been pressed into service against their will, men who had every reason to want the British operation to fail. That detail matters more than almost anything else I am going to tell you today. Because when you do not know the water you are sailing into, and the people guiding your ships do not want you to succeed, you are not running a military operation anymore. You are running a very expensive gamble. And then there was the fort itself. When General Charles Lee, one of the Continental Army's most experienced senior officers, and second in rank only to George Washington, arrived in Charleston and took one look at the construction, he called it a slaughter pen. He told the commander directly, "When those ships come alongside your fort, they will knock it down in half an hour." The commander looked back at him and did not move an inch. Here is something that most people who tell this story leave out completely, and I think it is one of the most remarkable details of the entire American Revolution. On the morning of the 28th of June, 1776, the exact same morning that 9 British warships were unfurling their sails off the coast of Sullivan's Island, Thomas Jefferson and the Committee of Five were walking into the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia to present the first draft of the Declaration of Independence to the Continental Congress. 2 events that would define the future of America were happening simultaneously, roughly 700 miles apart. One was happening with quill pens and parchment in a quiet room. The other was about to happen with 300 cannons and 12 tons of gunpowder on a strip of sand off the South Carolina coast. The British fleet that morning was formidable by any standard. The flagship HMS Bristol carried 50 guns. The HMS Experiment also carried 50. Behind them came 7 more vessels, including the bomb ship HMS Thunder, which carried 13-inch mortars, the kind of heavy siege weapon designed specifically to drop explosive shells inside fortifications and destroy them from within. In total, the fleet mounted nearly 300 heavy cannons. The fort facing them had 31, a mix of 9-pounders, 12-pounders, a few British 18-pounders, and some French 26-pounders. And each of those 31 guns had roughly 28 rounds of ammunition available. After that, they were done. So the commander inside that fort gave an order that I believe was the single most important tactical decision of the entire battle. His men were to fire slowly, one round every 10 minutes, aimed only at the ships closest to the fort. Every shot had to count. Nobody was to fire in a panic. Think about what that actually means in practice. You are a soldier, most of you trained as infantry, not as artillerymen. You are standing inside an unfinished fort on a sandbar. You can see 9 warships approaching with nearly 300 guns pointed directly at you. And your commander is telling you to wait, breathe, and make every single round matter. That is not just a tactical order. That is a test of human character under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Around 10:30 in the morning, the British opened fire. HMS Thunder began lobbing mortar shells toward the fort. Then Bristol, Experiment, Active, and Sola Bay moved into position about 400 yards offshore and let loose with full broadside simultaneously. The roar of that opening salvo must have been absolutely deafening. Thousands of pounds of iron screamed through the air toward that sandy island. And then something happened that nobody in the British fleet was prepared for. The cannonballs hit the palmetto log walls and simply stopped. Now I want you to understand the physics of what was happening here, because this is the part that separates this battle from every other engagement of the Revolution. Palmetto wood is fundamentally different from the oak or pine used in every European fortification of that era. Oak and pine are hard and rigid. When a cannonball strikes them, the impact energy has nowhere to go, so the wood shatters explosively, sending thousands of razor-sharp splinters in every direction. Those splinters were often more lethal than the cannonball itself. But palmetto wood is soft and deeply fibrous, almost spongy in its internal structure. When a cannonball strikes palmetto, the fibers compress and wrap around the projectile. The ball does not shatter the wall. It buries itself inside the wall, like a fist pushing into a pillow. The 16-foot gap of packed sand between the 2 parallel log walls absorbed whatever shock remained. And there was one more layer of protection the British did not know about, a natural marshy hollow inside the fort's center. Any mortar shell that cleared the walls and landed inside, instead of exploding on hard ground, sank into the waterlogged earth and was swallowed before it could detonate properly. HMS Thunder, carrying those powerful 13-inch mortars, quickly became a case study in the danger of overconfidence. When the first rounds failed to destroy the fort, the British crew began packing extra gunpowder into the mortars to increase their velocity. The result was catastrophic for the ship itself. The wooden brackets holding the mortars in place buckled under the increased pressure, tore through the ship's deck from below, and began destroying HMS Thunder from the inside out. By mid-afternoon, she had to withdraw from the battle entirely, defeated not by American fire but by her own crew's desperation. Meanwhile, the American gunners were doing exactly what they had been told. Slow, deliberate, devastatingly accurate. A British engineer aboard one of the ships later admitted that the American fire was surprisingly well served, slow but decisive, and that the gunners clearly took care not to fire until their aim was certain. The 2 biggest ships, Bristol and Experiment, absorbed the full concentration of that fire. Bristol alone took 70 direct hits to her hull. Chain shot destroyed much of her rigging and severely damaged both her mainmast and her mizzenmast. Twice during the battle, American fire swept the entire quarterdeck of the flagship clean of every officer standing on it except for the Commodore himself. The ship's captain had his right arm blown off by a cannonball and died days later on a hospital ship. The deposed royal governor of South Carolina, who had volunteered to man a gun aboard Bristol that day, was torn open by a wooden splinter, a wound that would slowly kill him over the next 2 years. and Commodore Parker himself was struck by a flying splinter that pierced his knee and simultaneously ripped the seat of his pants clean off, leaving the commander of the entire British fleet standing on his shattered quarterdeck with his backside exposed to the open air. He could not walk without being supported on both sides. 3 frigates, sent to circle around and attack the fort's open rear, ran their hulls onto a submerged sandbar called the Middle Ground. The pilots guiding them, men who had been forced into service against their will, had guided the ships directly into catastrophe. 2 of the 3 managed to pull themselves free. But HMS Actaeon, one of the Royal Navy's newest warships, commissioned less than a year earlier, was stuck hard in the sand. By morning, her captain would set her on fire rather than let her fall into American hands. A group of Americans rowed out to the burning vessel, boarded it under the smoke, and grabbed the ship's bell, her colors, and whatever supplies they could carry before the flames drove them back. Then came the moment that I believe captures the entire spirit of this battle in a single image. A British cannonball struck the fort's flagpole and snapped it in 2, sending the blue crescent flag tumbling over the wall and down onto the beach outside. In the 18th century, a flag coming down during a battle meant one thing to everyone watching: surrender. The men inside the fort saw it fall. The British sailors saw it fall. The citizens of Charleston watching from the harbor saw it fall. And then a sergeant, a man whose origins historians still debate to this day, a man who may have arrived in America as a European immigrant who could not read or write, who signed his name with an X when he first swore allegiance to his new country, climbed through a cannon port in the wall, dropped down onto the open beach under full British bombardment, picked up the fallen flag, tied it to a gunner's sponge staff, climbed back up, and planted it on the rampart where every person on that island could see it. He was not hit. The flag was still flying, and the garrison kept fighting. By 9 o'clock that night, Commodore Parker had seen enough. After nearly 12 hours of continuous bombardment, the most he had managed to accomplish was to bury a few thousand cannonballs inside a wall of trees and throw a great deal of sand around. He signaled the withdrawal. By 11:30 that night, the British fleet limped back to their anchorage outside the harbor. The Battle of Sullivan's Island was over, and the numbers tell the story more clearly than anything else I could say. The British fired roughly 7,000 cannonballs at that fort and burned more than 12 tons of gunpowder. They lost over 200 men killed and wounded, plus an entire warship. The Americans expended fewer than 1,000 rounds total, roughly 1/7 of what the British fired, and suffered 17 killed and between 20 and 26 wounded. That is not a close battle. That is one of the most lopsided victories in the entire American Revolution. Now, I want you to sit with the timing of this for a moment, because it matters enormously. This was June of 1776. The Declaration of Independence had not yet been signed. The Continental Army was still learning how to function as a fighting force, and a very large number of ordinary Americans were genuinely uncertain whether this revolution was a righteous cause or a collective death sentence. Then the news from Charleston began spreading up the coast. A colonial militia colonel with a handful of cannons and a fort made of trees had stood up to the most feared navy on the planet and sent them retreating into the dark. That news did not just boost morale. It changed the way people thought about what was possible. If that could happen, then maybe independence was not a fantasy. Maybe it was actually within reach. In London, the reaction was the opposite. The defeat at Sullivan's Island became a scandal and a source of savage public mockery. Satirical poems attacked Parker by name. A widely circulated song, written as though Parker himself were the author, ended with the humiliated Commodore slinking off to New York to lick his wounds, boasting that the entire continent would surely fall next year if only the cowardly Yankees would cooperate. The British press had an absolute field day with the image of a Royal Navy Commodore who had literally lost his trousers to a colonial militia defending a fort built from swamp trees. It was, by any measure, one of the great public humiliations in the history of the Royal Navy. The aftermath for the man who commanded that fort was swift and well-deserved. The South Carolina legislature renamed the fort in his honor within days of the battle. The Continental Congress passed a formal resolution of thanks. He was promoted to brigadier general in September of 1776. General Charles Lee, the same man who had called the fort a slaughter pen just days before the battle, wrote to George Washington that the commander deserved the highest honors the nation could offer. When Charleston finally fell to the British in 1780, 4 years later, the British had learned their lesson well enough to bypass the fort entirely and attack the city from the landward side. He was taken prisoner. The British knew his two brothers were loyalists, and they offered him his freedom, a British colonel's commission, and command of a regiment in Jamaica if he would switch sides. He looked at them and said that not even the full value of that island would be enough to make him abandon his integrity. He remained a prisoner until 1782, when he was exchanged and immediately promoted to Major General, the last man Congress appointed to that rank during the entire war. After independence was secured, he served 2 terms as governor of South Carolina. In 1802, at the age of 72, living in financial hardship, he gathered his personal papers and published a 2-volume memoir that remains one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of the Revolution in the Southern colonies. He died in Charleston on the 27th of September, 1805, having lived long enough to see the country he helped create grow from a collection of rebellious colonies into a functioning republic. The blue crescent flag he designed for his regiment still flies today over the state of South Carolina. A palmetto tree was added to the center of that flag in honor of the logs that saved the fort, and that design has been the state's official banner ever since. Fort Moultrie remained an active military post for nearly 2 centuries, all the way through World War II. It sits on the southern tip of Sullivan's Island today, open to visitors, a quiet place of sand and concrete that looks nothing like the desperate scene of June 1776. But the palmetto trees are still there. And if you ever look at the South Carolina state flag and wonder why there is a tree on it, now you know. It is there because on the worst day the Royal Navy ever had, in 1776, a tree is what beat them. And that, to me, is the most American story I know. Not the story of the biggest army or the most powerful fleet, but the story of the right man, in the right place, who refused to leave, and who built something that nobody thought would hold out of the only material he had available. If this story moved you the way it moves me every time I come back to it, drop a comment below and tell me which historical battle you think deserves more attention. And make sure you subscribe and hit that like button so you do not miss what we cover next.